Hi, everyone. So good to see you, sort of. Welcome to the closing night film of the 21st Annual Rutgers Jewish Film Festival. We are thrilled that you have joined us for the last 2 weeks on all of our webinars, and we hope you've enjoyed the films as much as we have enjoyed hosting them for you. I'm Nancy Simkoff. I'm the Academic Director of the Allen and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and Professor of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers. And my field of expertise is the history of the Jews of Eastern Europe. So this film has particular resonance for me. I want to thank the staff who has worked tirelessly to launch this festival, to run this festival, to answer all your questions. And this digital pivot, which is such a challenge for all of us emotionally and professionally, has made the film festival particularly challenging, but they rose to the occasion and went even further. So I want to thank Karen Small, the managing director of the Allen and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and the director of the film festival for the last 21 years. And I want to thank Sara Portilla, who is our special events coordinator, program coordinator, who also has worked tirelessly on all aspects of the festival, which, by the way, starts, almost, well, early in the spring of 2020. What you're seeing is the end result of it. Darcy Marr does our publicity. Jenny Gurman is the senior department and center administrator, who again has worked tirelessly. And Hannah Feldman has worked as our administrative assistant. I just want to thank all of them. Without them, believe me, it would not happen. And it certainly wouldn't happen the way it does, so professionally and without any glitches. So thank you to the staff, and I really salute you in every way. You're all muted. This is the webinar form, and you can ask questions of Dr. Smith, who I'm going to introduce soon, in the chat, and I will field them at the end of my discussion with him at the end of the webinar. Again, this is the closing night of the Rutgers Jewish Film Festival, and the film is My Name is Sara. Dr. Stephen D. Smith is a theologian by training, and he is the Finci Viterbi Endowed Executive Director of the USC Shoah Foundation and an adjunct professor of religion at USC, the University of Southern California. Dr. Smith founded the UK Holocaust Center in England and co-founded the Aegis Trust for the Prevention of Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide. He was also the inaugural chairman of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, which runs the National Holocaust Memorial Day in the UK. He was the project director responsible for the creation of the Kigali Genocide Memorial Center in Rwanda and trustee of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. I think you can see from this mention, before I continue, the relationship of the USC Shoah Foundation, the collection of testimonies to not only the Jewish experience in those horrible times, but to the larger issues of genocide. And the Shoah Foundation, I'm sure he will speak to it, is very active now in collecting testimonies from a variety of experiences in the world. Dr. Smith has produced several documentary films. These include The Last Goodbye, an award-winning virtual reality film that transports viewers inside the Nazi death camp known as called Majdanek, and The Girl in the Picture, an award-winning documentary that centers on the survivor of the 1937 Nanjing massacre in China. His writings include Never Again, Yet Again, a personal struggle with the Holocaust and genocide. And he has been recognized by many, many organizations for his work, including the Interfaith Gold Medallion as the Order of the British Empire. And he holds 2 honorary doctorates, one from Nottingham Trent University and the other from the University of Leicester. I'm really delighted to have him here. And as I mentioned to him in our prep, I had the great privilege of being a short-term fellow at the USC Shoah Foundation, where I began the process of listening to testimonies, particularly of the Eastern borderlands, in order to teach courses, to use them in courses on the region. I teach a course called Between Nazism and Communism, which focuses on the Eastern borderlands. So I'm just thrilled to have you here and very honored that you're closing off our very successful festival. Thank you so much. So I'm going to start with, I guess, the question that we always start with was why this film now, and why this particular testimony, the testimony of Sara Shapiro. What made you do it? What made the USC Foundation choose this?
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this closing night at Rutgers. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I also want to just thank everybody that's put this program together in these trying circumstances. You know, film festivals are about people coming together and to experience in the theatre the most beautiful experiences of that cinema can bring. And you know, we've had to adapt this year and to keep encouraging filmmakers to keep making films for the big screen, because we still need to have the beauty of the creativity that filmmakers like Steve Orrit has put into this film, My Name is Sara. So like a lot of films, there's a story behind the story, as you can imagine. In fact, Sara Shapiro was the mother of a board member of the Shoah Foundation. And so I got to know her through the family connections, and in fact had the privilege of interviewing her for the Shoah Foundation, which we'll come back to a little later. It was a really powerful experience to interview her for the foundation and for the archive. Completely separately to that, Mickey Shapiro, her son, had met the other executive producer, Andy Intrata, in a social context, and a bit of Jewish geography came into play. And it didn't take them more than a few minutes to discover that their families had grown, you know, being a stone's throw away from each other in the Ukraine, and they were both children of survivors, and that they had, although they didn't know each other at the time, were in exactly the same milieu, and had grown up in the same, you know, as descendants of the same experiences of, you know, the Einsatzgruppen coming in, and all of the events that we see and hear about, and the ghettoization of the Jews in those small little villages in the Ukraine. And so they took a journey together, for Mickey to go back, for the first time, to go and visit the area where his parents were from, and an area that Andy knew pretty well. And I was in Europe at the time, and although I didn't go to Koretz with them, or Drohobych, which was the other town that they went to, I was with them in Germany, where obviously their families had come into the DP camps. And at the end of Sarah's story, which is not in the movie, it was the fact that she met her husband back in Koretz, and he went first to Germany, and she followed him, and they were in a DP camp near Frankfurt, and Mickey Shapiro was born there. I was at the end of the story and didn't go to the Ukraine and didn't hear the whole story of Sara Shapiro on location, but the two of them explored it together. And Andy, who is who sort of led this initial idea to make this film, felt that her story really merited making into a movie, because the story of these children that escaped from ghettos and found their way and you know, became these maids under separate identities. He felt that was not a story that people knew well. And so he began with Steve Orrit to put the film into pre-production. And along the way, as the film was developing as an idea, we came together to say, how can we make this movie together to make it, you know, tell the story of Sara. And interestingly, the testimony of Sara was the secondary point for Steve and Andy, which was, how do we tell the story of this woman? Oh, let's go and look at the testimony and see what it has to say. Sara herself was still alive at that time, but she was aging, and dementia was, you know, had set in for her. So it was difficult for her to tell the story at that point. But the testimony became the guiding light, if you like, of the project, to say we want to tell this story as truthfully and as close as we can to the original story. And so those two things were, the script and the testimony, were living alongside each other.
So I just want to emphasize one point and then ask you a little bit more about that, about the adaptation of the testimony to the film. But I just want to emphasize for our watchers, for people attending, our audience, you know, one of the problems in the narration of the destruction of the Jews of Europe has been the iconization of Auschwitz and of and the misunderstanding of Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau, right? And if you will, the concentration camp and then the death camp experience, which is horrifying experiences, obviously, but Auschwitz in particular, where there were many more survivors, Birkenau very few, really negates or pushes to the side or marginalizes the experience in the Eastern borderlands. And the film takes place in Ukraine, and there were many people, many hidden Jews in Ukraine and in the northern borderlands in Belarus and in the forests. And these were people who, if they were ghettoized, it was brief. And then if they escaped, it was because they got out before an action was taken. But they never experienced, many of them never experienced the concentration camp or the death camp. And the invasion of the German army, and then with the Einsatz, the mobile killing squads in 1941, really changed the whole geopolitical issue for Jews in those lands, and as well as the local populations. The Ukrainians, people need to understand, are also under German occupation. And that's after having lived under the Soviets. And that's such an important part of the war, 41 till 44. And as you said, and Mickey Shapiro understood this, many people do not know the regionality of it and the specificity of it. So in that regard, it's an incredibly important corrective to the focus on Auschwitz as a symbol of all the evil during these years. So I just wanted to highlight that.
I think I'll just add to that as well, Nancy. I think the point you're making is a really important one, that the history of the Holocaust has become about the death camps and the concentration camps, and yet 1.5 million Jews, at least, were murdered in forests and ditches that no one ever saw and remain to this day largely unmarked. And that is true of Sarah's own family. They were taken from, they were in the ghetto of Koretz for over a year, but they remained, they remain anonymous in their deaths. The other thing that I thought was very powerful about this, let me tell you about taking Sara's testimony for one moment, because
sure. What can you tell us what year you did that? What year you did this testimony?
I think it was 14. I think it was 2014.
So she was really older. I mean, it was not a young testimony.
Yes, no, this was relatively recently. Right. And interestingly, I think that she had avoided as much as possible telling her story. On the surface of it, it says, oh, okay, well, here's a young girl who was with, until 1941, the Nazis were not in Koretz. Right. And then she's in the care of her parents until 1942. She escapes from the ghetto with her brother, and then she's a maid. So on the surface, it looks like she has 2 years as a maid. And one might think, well, that was lucky. I have to say, I have interviewed hundreds of Holocaust survivors. Sara Shapiro was probably one of the most traumatized survivors I had ever interviewed. It remains to this day the most difficult interview that I have taken. And I have never seen the trauma of that 11-year-old who basically hardly slept for 2 years for fear of her life, the sleep deprivation, and we'll go into a little bit later, I think, that the sense of guilt that woman carried
about her brother in particular.
All of her life was quite overwhelming, and she literally found it difficult to speak just from the trauma of speaking 70 years later. That's how difficult that experience was for that child.
No, I think it's an extremely important point about the intergenerational trauma. I mean, we know this. In our country, we're reckoning with other kinds of trauma now. I mean, trauma doesn't end, right? And it gets passed down psychologically in other ways too.
I mean, there are some hints to this as well, a little in the movie. When there's the idea of her putting tearing up the cloth and putting it in her mouth so that she didn't, start dreaming in Yiddish, because she created this whole identity for herself in Ukrainian. What that was pointing to in the movie is that she virtually never slept, and she had to be on her guard
all the time.
There's another feature that doesn't come out so strongly in the movie, because Sara in the movie had to say something, or at least have lines. She made a decision that she was going to be mute. So how this child worked this out at 11 years old, that the best survival strategy was to pretend that she couldn't hear and pretend that she found it difficult to speak. because she figured out that the more she spoke, the more she could incriminate herself. And so she had this persona in which she was basically around that family, listening to everything, responding to very little, and trying to keep herself as hidden as possible in broad daylight, because she knew that effectively, if she was discovered as being Jewish, or if she gave herself away by a slip of the tongue, that she would be murdered. And so basically she saved her own life through her own strategies, which is quite a remarkable aspect of her life.
So just for our viewers, a book was a novel called Wartime Lies by Louis Begley, and I commend it to all of you, tells a similar novelistic story of all the lies. I mean, that's the thing. She had to lie consistently, take on a new persona, pretend she was her good friend Manya, lie about, no, she knew the Catholic ritual, she knew the Ukrainian Christian ritual, forget her Jewish background, deny her Jewishness, deny that she had a family. The lies upon lies upon lies as a survival strategy. And I think she was an uncommon person, because every individual is uncommon, but that was a strategy for many people who were lucky enough to survive, because she could have been exposed any minute. So let me ask you about that. I'd like to ask you generally about the adaptation of the testimony to the screen and the screenplay, and how did you and how did the writers, Himmelstein, right, work with that? What did you leave out? What did you embellish for narrative reasons? And in particular, after you do the general, I know you mentioned something about the story of the farmer and the Jewish girl, Rachel. If you could illuminate those tensions and how the movie decided to tell that story.
Yes, it's a really interesting dilemma, Nancy, in terms of you have the testimony, so therefore you have the actual words of the survivor themselves and how they describe their story. The making of a feature film is a creative process, and you're telling a story. So the question is, the first thing you have to come to terms with is this is not a documentary. It's storytelling to take the viewers on a journey through the life of this young girl and what she encountered. So we had, various conversations about where does the line, if you're saying this is based on a true story, where does the line between Sarah's actual story and the story of children like her and experiences like hers come together? And, where's the bright white line between falsification and adaptation? And there's a tension there, actually. And it's I'm sure David and Steve Orrit and, the creators will, remember the conversations that we had where I'm trying not to be the stern historian and say, listen, this is now falsification of the truth. And saying, well, let's just talk about this story and what it represents. And is it true? Is it true to Sarah's story and children like her, or are we now off in some sort of fantasy land, which actually is now no longer about the Holocaust itself? And so we had a lot of conversations like that. But some of the fine details were actually in the story. If I'm allowed to share screen, I'm not sure.
Yeah, please share screen. And if you have any trouble, give us a yell. We have tech on.
Have the facility. Let me just hop in here for a second.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
If I just go to My Name is Sara for a second, and we go back to that scene around about, I'm going to say it's about 4-ish. Oh, yes, here we go. She's talking to her brother in the barn at the beginning, and the woman that's hiding them, he's worried that she's going to give us away. So he's saying, I know she's going to turn us in. So you see here.
Od razu widać po mnie, że jestem Żydem. Po tobie nie, Saro, masz większe szanse beze mnie. Ale co zrobisz? Jak znowu będziesz musiała przepłynąć przez rzekę? Po prostu chodźmy stąd.
Poczekajmy, aż się ściemni. Masz rację. Przepraszam, bracie.
So the scene is there that they're in the barn, the woman's taken them in, and now she's scared for her life, and the two of them are deciding what do they do next. Now, in the original script, actually, the way it worked was that essentially Moshe, sends her away. But as you'll see in just a second, let's just go to her testimony. If I go to this is the Visual History Archive, and those of you who have not used it, we'll do a little tour here. You can go to VHS Online, that's Visual History Archive Online. In fact, I'll just stick this in the chat for you. When I come back, I'll put that in there for you. So we can go in here and let's just search people. So those of you who want to watch Sarah's testimony, now you've watched the movie about her, you can also go here, Sara Shapiro, and search that. And there'll be a bunch of people. In fact, let me just put interviewee only, female. And now we're going to get her, Sara Shapiro. When I go to her testimony, I'm going to go to, I'm going to cheat because I know where this piece is. But obviously, you can go and find that. You can see this is divided into 1 minute segments. So I'm going to cheat here and go to minute 45. This is minute 45, I think. And she, oops. I was asking her about that particular decision, I think, around about this time. See what happens.
Second side is Ukraine. And what do you do? Where do you go? What do you say? And I picked myself up and I says, I'm going that way, where the farmers, they might need help. And I walked and walked and walked.
Well, I think I might have missed it by 15 seconds, sorry. So what she basically says was, I got up and I walked out of the door and I didn't know, do I turn left or do I turn right? What Sarah actually says in her testimony is that she made the decision to leave her brother because she had worked out that if they both left together, then the chances are neither would survive. But if they split up, the chances of one of them would survive. And what she was basically saying to him was, I cannot afford to be with you because you're a Jewish male. And she left, age 11, on her own at night. Now, originally, that was not featured in the film. That was actually him as the older brother sort of allowing her to go and wishing her well. And in our conversations we had, it really focused on, so what did it take for an 11-year-old girl to leave her brother behind, knowing that he would probably die? And he did. And what that meant for the rest of her life. So that was a really tough one. And what I really appreciate about Steve Orritt, the director, was he went back to that scene and said, okay, let's reverse that. Let's find the way for that to be more close to the experience of this young girl who basically says, let's leave it until night. And then she just leaves him and walks away from him, which is really actually more or less what happened. So that's a very interesting sort of element to the dilemma and the tussle we had about how do you tell us? Because also what we were trying not to do was tell a story that was so traumatizing that for other, let's just say, young teenage girls watching this, to think about what she was doing, it would be really tough to watch. So we had those dilemmas.
I will say, though, I think it's particularly now in the landscape of the research on the Holocaust or the research on these events, it's very clear there was a difference if you were a Jewish woman and a Jewish man. And I mean, we've known this for a long time, but it's very clear that Jewish girls, particularly those who were educated in Polish public schools, who spoke excellent Polish and knew some Ukrainian, had a much, to the degree that any kind of background helped you survive, that was a step up or a leg up versus a yeshiva boy or someone who only knew Yiddish or whose Polish was inflected with Yiddish. And if you were male, if you were circumcised, which was
well, of course,
would be a telltale sign, obviously, of Jewishness and very vulnerable, very vulnerable.
Well, of course, also this was an irony of the way in which the Orthodox rabbinate treated the difference between boys' education and girls' education, because it was much more likely that girls would get a secular education than boys, and therefore much more likely that they would speak the language of Polish, Ukrainian, or whatever it was, than their brothers.
Yeah.
Not, and of course, not to mention that the circumcision difference and detection around, you know, the way in which. So, I mean, it would have taken 5 seconds for them to work out, you know, if she walked into that household that was trying to catch her out, if she'd been male, she would not have survived that, obviously. But as a female that spoke Ukrainian, that had the wits about her to adopt her schoolmate's identity and use her knowledge of the Christian faith, which she would not have got if she'd been a boy in yeshiva, set her in really good stead to be able to navigate that situation.
I mean, certainly the rabbinate in interwar Poland didn't know, but we now can see what those strategies, what kind of strategies were at her disposal in ways that not for certainly religious boys.
Nobody.
So what other, I mean, I'm sure there were many, but what were you did mention the case of Rachel. What were the other big discussions, testimony versus screenplay that came up?
Let's just do one more little demo of that. This is
Sure.
the moment where she walks in and finds this girl Lydia in the barn, and I'll just play just a few seconds to remind you of the interchange, and then we'll just go to her testimony as well for 30 seconds.
Lydia. Are you a Jew? I'm just hungry.
Okay, so you remember the scene that she goes in, she says she's hungry, and then the next time you see the girls, they're in the hayloft and she's trying to teach her how to do the Hail Mary, and she's not doing so well at that because she didn't have that education and she wasn't equipped to survive in the environment. Now, what we learned from her testimony about Rachel is, and we also learned from the film that the girl was killed and that they have the gold coins that she had. So in fact, the gold coins are all absolutely true. She showed up with the gold coins. She came into the house and she was asking initially the man and woman in the house in order to be able to, Pavlo and Nadia, as they are in the film, to help her. What we learned from the testimony, though, is that Pavlo is much more involved than the film suggests. So let's just listen to what she says about that. She's talking about what happened after the girl had come.
The people that hired me, and I said, Chacha Ala, there is a lady here, and she asked me for a piece of bread. And I gave it to her. And she says, well, take a look if there is on the table. And I gave it to her. And I don't remember. I think I gave her a piece of bread. And she didn't want to leave. She wanted to stay. And I just walked away.
How did you feel when you heard what had happened to her?
Bad. Real bad.
Were there any other people that you came into connection with while you were there that were either in hiding or other?
Well, they were bandits.
I'll stop it there because it goes round about a little bit. What she reveals is that the husband and the brother, while she's sitting washing pots in her mute state, start to discuss and laugh about the fact that they had taken the girl and that they had raped her.
Yeah.
So the husband is one of the killers of the girl, so which doesn't appear in the movie. And so the question was, what role should this Pavlo character have in the movie? Sara herself obviously felt extremely guilty because she had walked away from Rachel, left her on the doorstep with the bread, and then the next thing she hears is she's dead and that the coins are in the house. But what she also discovers is that the brother, the two brothers are responsible for the killing of this young girl. So we had a lot of discussion about that in terms of what this character Pavlo, not far from him being righteous among the nations and sheltering a Jewish girl, he's continually trying to harass her and reveal her Jewish identity, and is also a killer. And so what we felt was, in the end, that this film was actually about a lot of different types of gray zone, where the partisans, the family that take her in, even Sara herself, when she becomes Manya, is living in a changed identity, and in an identity that she didn't choose, in a situation that she didn't choose, in which she adapts to survive, and that all of them have adapted to survive in different ways. And we have this sort of very black and white image, I think, of, you know, so this dualism of like good and evil. You're either on the Nazi side or on the Jew side. You're on one side or the other. But in fact, there were a lot of individuals that were floating through these different identities by which you could be somewhat benevolent and turn a blind eye to one Jewish girl that you know is Jewish, but you just can't quite pinpoint it. Like, for example, when she decides to call their bluff, and they say, go and find your documents. She walks to go and find the documents, knowing that she's not going to find them. And then he goes after her. Actually happened. He brings her back because he knows that she's calling their bluff. He can't catch her out. And he goes, you know what? If you're so smart, it's fine. So he turns a blind eye, knowing that he probably could catch her out, but decided not to. And so you have these sort of these fluid identities. And I think that's one of the things that we see as we study the period of the Holocaust, that yes, there are these defining moments. There's nothing more defining than the Einsatzgruppen coming into Koretz and clearing out the ghetto and murdering her family. And yet at the same time, the survival techniques and opportunities are, particularly the further east you go, the more fluid they become in some senses. On the one hand, they are absolutely defined by the mass murder of the Einsatzgruppen, and on the other hand, if you can find a space and carve out a space, then maybe there's a way to survive. And Sara was a good example of that, of living that kind of fluid gray zone of identity.
Yeah, I think it's extremely well taken. Another way of thinking about it, which is something I think many of us grapple with, is individual agency in the middle of a situation where there's such constriction about how much you can move in any one direction. And, part of that comes out in the film about the Ukrainians. Again, this is such complicated history, but people may not realize that the Ukrainians, you intimated, the Ukrainians have been living under Soviet rule, and most Ukrainians hated Soviet rule. The Soviets were very hostile to the Ukrainians. They collectivized them. They wanted to break up individual farms. They consider them a lower level Slav. So when the Germans first invaded, some, not all, but some Ukrainians viewed the Germans as a better regime. And that complicates, of course, the way they did and did not treat Jews. And so there was, and then there's the partisans, some of whom are Polish partisans, some of whom are Russian partisans, some of whom are Jewish partisans, and they need the resources of the Ukrainian peasantry, and they will stop at nothing to get those resources, food and money and furs, to survive in the forest. So, and so that the film highlights those dilemmas. I have a question. To what degree is this sort of intrigue of the Ukrainian family, was that part of Sara's testimony, the sort of infidelity of the wife, her unhappy marriage, her love affairs, the husband's knowledge that he was being cuckolded, and Sara's problem because she was witness to that? Is that in the testimony?
So some of it, yes, some of it is made for the movie. In fact, the reason she was hired in the first instance is because the previous maid had been thrown out. Because in fact the husband had been unfaithful to the wife, as she had discovered. So and he was pleased to have a young child rather than a woman in the home, because she at least felt that maybe that would give her some protection from his infidelity.
Mhm.
The aspect of the nephew is not actually real to the story, but there were definitely, you know, the way in which the family interacted with each other and the brother is how she describes it. And there's no question that the brother lived nearby. It was about a 10-minute walk away.
You mean the brother of Pavel?
Of
The
Pavel.
one who in the film is the perpetrator of the rape and the murder.
Correct.
But Pavel was exonerated, but the brother, the drunk brother.
And the family dynamics more or less match what she describes. Obviously, the filmmakers wanted to bring a little bit more intrigue into the family dynamics. What is interesting though is Nancy, the way in which the film explores the experiences of the Ukrainian population and the way in which they experienced the Nazis.
Yeah.
I think was a very, very good addition, because in a sense the Jews were just, I mean, they were their neighbors, but they weren't their friends. And they may have in some cases been their enemies, but most of them were in this situation where they weren't quite sure what to do about what was happening to the Jews, not least because they themselves were being pillaged and you know, persecuted at some level, or at least you know, they were living in very oppressive circumstances. And so you have this kind of normalcy that's going on, and yet at the same time, under that layer of normalcy, while they go to the market, on the one hand, the way in which the Germans were extracting for, you know, just keeping their military fed from the local population was overbearing, and I think it's a good depiction of that. But secondly, then there's these sort of substrata, so that you don't realize that the old woman actually is hiding Jews and will lose her life for it.
Right.
And the penalty for doing so was the death of those who hid the Jews. So they weren't left with a lot of option. At least you had to be extremely courageous if you were to hide Jews, which is why I think there was hardly a rush for people to hide Jews and take the ultimate risk, which of course is what the woman who hid Sara and Moshe originally basically said, I'm out. I've got your parents' money, but that doesn't matter. I don't want to lose my life over it, and please leave. Was a probably very natural thing to say. It doesn't necessarily make her an anti-Semite. It makes her very protective of herself and her family, of course, which probably, you know, was a natural thing to do. And on the other hand, you've got the image of the priest. Now, it's interesting. One of the discussions we had was that the original script had literally the character of Andrzej Szymanski, who was a well-known priest in Lvov, not far from where all this took place, who had rescued Jewish people, but to this day has not been made righteous among the nations, because he also welcomed the Nazis into the Ukraine in 1941 for the very reason that you mentioned a moment ago, that the oppression of communism and of the Soviet Union was such that actually the Nazis to some were a liberating force, including to him.
Remember, people need to remember that the Soviets were anti-religious. This was a forced secularism. So under Soviet occupation, not only were synagogues closed and Hebrew made forbidden, but if you were a Christian priest, you also lost your life, and your churches were closed. So the Germans, as horrible as they were not against religion per se. So a Ukrainian priest might have thought, oh, I will be able to minister to my parish under the Germans better than I can minister to my parish under the Soviets. Right.
Now, Sara in real life does not talk about, you know, a priest that was in her life. But I think what the filmmakers were trying to do, and which I think from a historical perspective is really interesting from the film, if you like, if you just take the testimony as the core of it, and then these sort of circles, concentric circles around it, which are reflecting on what was happening with the partisans at the same time. How was it affecting the Ukrainian population at the time? While not a core part of Sara's actual story, was the milieu in which she was living. And the story of the priest, you know, which reflects the story of Andrzej Szeptycki, we decided not to actually make it Andrzej Szeptycki because of the controversy around his, you know,
recognition.
recognition. We didn't want it to become about that character. But he represents, if you like, that in the priesthood at that time, there were those who were trying to do the right thing, knowing that it might not only cost them, but also their congregants. And we see that shooting scene where ultimately the priest, steps in and saves the child. It's a sort of a moment of martyrdom, and it's written for the film, and it's not, it's not true to a particular story, but it's trying to represent the fact that these individuals who were leaders had huge dilemmas to face in terms of how they behaved, how much they exposed themselves to the Nazis, how they best operated in order to be able to protect their own congregants, and at the same time, if they felt like that this what was happening was against their moral and Christian and ethical viewpoint, that they would take actions that they deemed were in resistance to the Nazis. Once again, like the righteous among the nations, I'm afraid to say it wasn't widespread, but those examples were there, and we wanted to be able to use the film to show the dilemmas that people found themselves in, and sort of some of the courses of action that ultimately were taken, including the shooting of Ukrainian civilians.
Well, I think also back to the gray zone concept, we know that some people did the right thing for the wrong reasons, right? They did it because they thought there was going to be a reward at the end, or they did it because it gave them certain status, or if they were a smuggler. We know this. There's some other wonderful films that have portrayed this. Agnieszka Holland's In Darkness and shows this. You could have a sort of a petty thief who saved Jews, not because out of ethics, just did it. And I think that we live, maybe Americans more than anyone else, we really want we want pure goodness and pure evil. Right. And it's look, in the history of World War II and the destruction of the Jews, there's sort of a generalized evil, right, which is the ideology of Nazism. But how it plays out on the ground and in the variety of regions in Eastern Europe, and particularly the distinction, as I keep emphasizing, and you've mentioned, between 1939 to 1941, and then 1941 to the end of the war, with the German occupation of Eastern Europe and of Soviet Poland. That's the research today has really highlighted that, and what it meant to survive, like Sara, versus someone who survived a labor camp or death march or Auschwitz or etc. So it's in that regard very important. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, and of course the end of the war in this case was 1944.
Right.
Not 45. So you also have this sort of, it starts later and ends earlier, but was much, in many senses, was much more brutal in the middle, insofar as, if you were living in those territories, then you were consistently under threat of death every single day.
Right.
And so,
also, just because of the armies going back and forth. I mean,
right.
People sometimes don't realize that the Jews just lived in the center of conflagration between West and East, and the same thing was true of World War I. Right? Jews lived between the Germany and Russia.
I see there's a question here about.
Yeah. So let's see. It's already 7:44. I'm really curious about her life in the DP camps, but I think we should go to our audience. So let's see what we have in our chat. Okay. Yes. So great. I'm very grateful for that question. That's on my mind all the time, is languages. So. An attendee of the webinar is saying, how is the choice of language made? We hear Polish, we hear Yiddish, we hear Russian, but Sara herself, and the film is really an English language film. So what was the choice there? Which arguably was, for those of us who care about the region, might have done it differently. What was the screenwriter's thought there?
Yeah, I think this came very much from the director. He wanted to make a movie in Poland, or at least in the region that was, it's not the exact same Koretz, but it's in the region. That would be, and he wanted to make it with actors from the region too. So this is an American film shot in Europe, by which, apart from the director and producers and screenwriter, basically everybody else involved, including the cinematographers and the editors and everybody else, are in Poland. And the young woman that plays Sara didn't speak English when she was auditioned. at all.
Amazing, amazing.
And she did a fantastic webinar recently in English, which was just
You
amazing.
know, I think we'll try and put that in the chat because someone put it up, we can find it for you. So Dr. Smith and the director and the children, Mickey Shapiro and Susanna, who was the actor, who played Sara, did a really wonderful webinar, and it's very illuminating. So go ahead, but people should know. Yeah.
It was a very, very interesting choice on Steve's part to film in Poland. I'm actually really glad that he did. The issue is then comes to language. So what language are they going to be acting in? And so there is this sort of tension a little bit between the fact that they are Polish actors speaking English in what is effectively an English language film, with all sorts of other sort of bits of language thrown in. I actually, it's very unusual to do that. I'm very pleased that he chose to do it that way. There is a sort of an authenticity, I want to say, around them as actors on the journey they went on with the film themselves, and particularly Susanna, who played Sara. Just going on this journey to discover this young woman who had been approximately her age 75 years ago, going through that experience in what is now her country. No, actually, it was in the Ukraine. It was in Poland then, and now it's.
It was in Poland then, right?
Yeah.
Korzec is no longer, right? Drohobych are now in Ukraine. They're not.
Is now the Ukraine.
Right.
But just to know that for her, to see her as a young person going through that learning journey was remarkable, actually, in its own right. And I think it situates itself in an interesting situation from a market perspective. Like, where do you play this movie, and who is it for? It's found a very good niche, I have to say, with teenagers of all backgrounds. I think it's seen by teenagers to be something that's very relevant to their lives. In fact, one of its first outings was to the film festival in Italy, the Children's Film Festival.
The youth festival in Italy, right?
Yeah, and great reception there, including by young people themselves. And I think if we were to ask the executive producers, Mickey and Andy, what they would think, its future would be for, I think they would love to see it having that role for teenagers who are learning about the Holocaust, not from the typical history perspective of the Nazis came to power, the Jews were taken to Auschwitz, and everyone was murdered. But here's the story of a young Jewish girl living in a place that you will never have heard of, and what she went through in the journey of adolescence that she had. I think is where they would probably say it's got its most resonance. So it's become an international film, I think.
Right. I wonder, I mean, look, many Europeans know English, as opposed to Americans who don't. So if it was shown to youth in Poland or Israel, let's say, or Ukraine or Belarus today, many young people would know English, but it was a choice. That's all. It was a cinematic choice to have it in English.
But it's obviously a little weird when it's subtitled in Polish,
right? Because
you've got a Polish cast, titled back into from English back to Polish. But other than that, I think I personally believe it's, although an unusual choice, I think it's worked actually very well for audience.
Very, very interesting. So we have a couple of other questions. Did Sara Shapiro ever go back to the region?
She didn't go back to the region, and she had no intention of going back to that family. I think, and even any thought that they might be, have any recognition for saving her was the furthest thing from her mind. She was just completely traumatized by their behavior. And so I don't think she had a need or an interest to do that.
And someone is interested about whether or not, do we know from her testimony or from what her sons know about her, did she ever think about joining the partisans?
Well, you have to remember she was 11, 12, and 13, but during that time. So although the whole idea in the film is that she kind of has this sort of flirtation with joining the partisans, I think she saw them as being heroes rather than necessarily heroes that a 12-year-old could go and sign up. I think she was largely focused on protecting herself. Nevertheless, they were very much a feature of the landscape, and so it's appropriate that they're in the film, but she wasn't about to leave that family and join them, because I think that would have been a stretch for her at that age.
I mean, I may be not 100% accurate what I'm about to say, but my understanding is, there were women and other young people who joined the partisans, but they had come out of the socialist and revolutionary youth movements of which there were many in interwar Poland. And when those young people were ghettoized, and there was a decision to make, should we resist or should we leave? They joined the partisans. And again, I can't help but mention films that we've shown here in the Rutgers Jewish Film Festival. We've shown films by Aviva Kempner, and one of her first films is called The Partisans of Vilna. And you see women who are in the partisan bands, and Sara's experience, they were used as couriers often to go from one place to another, because they wouldn't be discovered as Jews because of lacking the circumcision. So again, the gendered nature of the Holocaust experience, and for women in the partisan units. But Sara didn't come from, at least the way her family is described, it's a bourgeois family. She's going to a Christian school. She's Polonized. And I didn't get the sense her family, although Jewishly identified, they were not involved with, she wasn't involved with the youth movements that might have predisposed her to join the partisans. And again, of course, it was very dangerous to do such a thing.
Right. Interesting enough, we just interviewed a lady called Judith Ginsburg in Coconut Creek in Florida week before last, who did go on that exact journey, and as a 15-year-old did become a partisan because she had that political background, and she's still alive and well today. And in fact, just did a full 5-day interactive interview, which is amazing.
Amazing.
Somebody has memories of the partisans from her mid and late teens, but joining at around the age of 15. So
right, they were young. I mean, all the ghetto fighters were kids. I mean, kids by standards of today.
Yeah.
So we have another question from the chat. How did, besides her, how did the extended family respond to the film?
Oh, I was there when at least one of her sons watched it in its full, and her daughter-in-law in its sort of full and finished form. And let's just say we were due to go to dinner after we watched the final cut, and we didn't. It was very overwhelming and emotional to see. And at that point, Sara had just passed away, and it was just, to see her in that form was very overwhelming. And I think in a good way. I think it's also, healing on one level, and to know that her story lives on beyond her in a way that can reach a generation of the next generation of young people. I think there's a lot of gratification in that. And Sara, although she wasn't actively involved in making the film, knew the film was being made and was very much in approval of that, including knowing that it was an adaptation. So I think it's a very fitting tribute to her, and her family's I think pleased by that. Yeah.
So someone else asked the question, so it's not just mine. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened when she was liberated? In the film, we see that the partisans, she stands in the middle of that road and she screams out to them, I'm a Jew, after denying it for all those years. And you said she ended up going back to Kozetz and meeting her husband, or meeting the man who became her husband, and then he goes to Germany to a DP camp. Can you give us a little sense of what happens there?
So so she got back to Koretz. I mean, as you saw, she literally hitched a ride back there, and at this point, she was still a very young teenager, and so she tried to see who was alive. No one was alive. And so she's in Koretz when Asa, who became her husband, who was a little older than her, came back from Siberia. So he'd fled. He came back to Koretz in search of his family. And actually, you're right. Somebody making a point about the age. You're right. She was 14 at this point, and so by the time she was back in the ghetto, back in Koretz, she was 15, and then she's on her own. So when Asa goes to Germany, when he was in chorus, she asked him if he would marry her, to which he said no, and he left, leaving her.
Okay.
He was having none of that, and so she knew which DP camp he was going to, or at least where he was headed. And so she followed him, and she gets there, and a year later, when they were 16 or so, she gets married to him.
What do you know? What camp it was? It was in which zone it was? Do you know that or no? If not, don't.
I want to tell you.
It's okay.
I do know. Give me a second. Let's have a look while we're talking. So yeah, but it was, you know, that it was definitely a love affair on her part, chasing Asa, and they lived a very long and happy and productive life. Just passed away in the last couple of years.
Right. But again, as you said, a happy and productive life, but haunted definitely by the experiences. How could she not be?
Definitely life.
Trying to see if there's any other questions that we can get to, or that I wanted to get to. So I guess from a pedagogic point of view, what are your plans for? I mean, we can't have a theatrical release right now because of COVID, and we don't know what films the theaters are going to look like. So what are the Shoah Foundation's pedagogic plans for this film? What are you hoping to do, or what do you know you're going to do?
So as you know, much of the work the Shoah Foundation does is digital education online. And so this film will have a series of educational units on the Eyewitness platform that will enable students who have seen the film to navigate it. We also will, when we work on a film like this, because obviously we work closely with the filmmakers and are associated to the movie, have the ability to turn it into chapters or to short sections and clips, so that actually students can work their way through themes, look at particular parts of the movie that tell a particular story, and then have a sort of a deep dive into the content that way. And so we can do either and both. We actually have a very active film section of Eyewitness, documentary films and short films, animated films, and as you heard earlier, virtual reality. And so we are involved in either making them or partnering filmmakers. So for example, at the moment, we're making a nice little set of films with Dr. Ruth Westheimer for primary school children. And we're the producers of those. So we're working to develop the film from scratch, and then including in that all of the educational materials. Whereas something like this particular movie, we've been involved very early in its development, but are there to help the movie to be successful and to support it, and then to enable it to have a long life in the educational world.
Well, thank you. What can we say? I mean, it's everything we've touched on, the complexity of her story, the emotion of it speaks for itself. And I think that it will be really useful, those short bites, as you said, for educational purposes. I think that's terrific.
And one of your attendees this evening just said there's lots of films like this one, like this.
Yeah, and I wanted an example. The attendee didn't tell us what I was looking for it, but they didn't say
this one. And I think one of the things that I'm always aware of when we come to projects like this, everybody has such a unique story. And it amazes me 30 years into this that every single day I learn something new and unique aspects of each of these stories. And I learned a lot from Sara Shapiro, and I'm very grateful to her for all that she taught me. And I'm glad that some of it's found its way into this beautiful rendition of her story that future generations can enjoy. And I'm just grateful to Mickey Shapiro and Andy Entrada for making sure that happened.
Yeah. Well, I think we're grateful to you, and I'm super pleased that you and I got to have this conversation, and I know that our audience really appreciated it. In the chat, there's a lot of information for all of you. There's the link to the webinar that Dr. Smith did with the actors, Zuzana and Mickey Shapiro, and the screenwriter and the directors. So that will really give you, again, a sort of behind the scenes view of how they made the choices they made. There's also the link to eyewitness.usc.edu about the various educational programs. So please, let this be the beginning of your own education about the work of the USC Shoah Foundation. And as Karen Small mentions, the Rutgers, the Bildner Center's Holocaust Resource Center, the HRC, and the Master Teacher Institute work with the Shoah Foundation and with testimonies to bring this material to high school and middle school teachers, who then bring it to students in New Jersey public schools, and are very, very successful. And I have always hoped that if Erna is able to travel again, I'll be able to use this in my teaching when I bring my students to Poland and to the region. Very, very useful. So I want to say goodnight to everyone. Before I do that, I want to say thank you for attending once again the Rutgers Jewish Film Festival in its 21st year. And lest you think you're going to get off the hook, we have yet another super program on December 7th. It's called Reproductive Authority Among Haredi Women. It's based on my colleague Michal Rauscher's new book, Conceiving Agency, Reproductive Authority Among Haredi Women. It will be a webinar on December 7th at 7 p.m. Professor Rauscher will be in conversation with journalist Avital Chisik Goldschmidt. It should be a great program on, again, this very complex issue of agency in certain social structures or certain parts of life. So it's very different from what you saw tonight, but it will be the same high caliber, I can assure you. So again, Dr. Smith, thank you so much. Thank you to the USC Shoah Foundation, and to all of our attendees. I wish you a safe, healthy, and meaningful Thanksgiving. And come again to the Rutgers Jewish Film Festival and click on the Bildner Center's webpage for our upcoming spring programs. Good night, stay safe. Thank you all.